And let me introduce Adam. Adam Davis grew up surrounded by the creative energy of his parents' church and developed an early fascination with the transformative power of art. He started his artistic journey at age 6 with drums, and as he transitioned into adulthood, he discovered a new avenue for creative expression through his photography, initially with his iPhone and sharing captures on social media. And his passion for photography blossomed into a commitment to street photography, navigating the diverse landscapes of New York City. However, it was his move to Los Angeles at the age of 21 to pursue a career in education that marked a significant turning point in his artistic evolution. In Los Angeles, Adam dedicated himself to capturing the narratives of Black Americans and the burgeoning creative communities that shaped the city's cultural landscape. It was during this period that Adam started experimenting with the wet plate collodion process, inspiring him to create evocative tintype portraits that resonate with a sense of history and authenticity. Now based in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Adam continues to refine and expand his artistic practice through Black Magic, a visionary project dedicated to creating the largest contemporary archive of Black American and global African diasporic tintype portraits. Through Black Magic, he seeks to celebrate and preserve the cultural richness and diversity of his community, while also challenging conventional narratives and stereotypes through the power of visual storytelling. And I hope you'll all welcome him. And Adam, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. What's going on, you guys? This is cool. I wish like everyone, like all my friends would do stuff like this. Just get on a Zoom call and just talk about cameras and photographs and all this stuff like that. I think it's really sweet, and to be invited to do this is an honor, and I really appreciate all you guys taking the time. Um, there's like a really specific like soft spot in my heart for New England specifically. Uh, I'm not that much into sports anymore, but in like middle school, junior high school, college, was a huge Patriots fan. And it like carried me through. Like I remember dating someone in high school who was a huge Giants fan, and we all know how that went. But we're like sitting in our jerseys on on like opposite sides of the room, like watching the Super Bowls and like hashing it out and having our fun. But like, yeah, having a relationship even to this day with not only just Massachusetts but the entire New England area has been really fun. I'm gonna get to starting this presentation. Can I get a quick thumbs up to make sure everyone can see? Perfect. Okay. So as Dana graciously shared, I've been working on a project called Black Magic. And it feels like this is the one thing that I get to do for the rest of my life. And I'm just really grateful that I found that thing. When I picked up a camera, it really wasn't even like a camera, I suppose. Like I bought an iPhone the day I graduated from high school. And I've just been obsessed with learning more and more, even to the point where I'm still learning about photography. I've never been to school to study art or to study photography whatsoever. And along this journey, I'm picking up little bits and pieces of information to then combine all of this knowledge into this ongoing practice to work on this project. Um, I'm a storyteller from Brooklyn. I know I said that I love New England for very specific reasons, but because I've traveled all over, making this work as well as many other works, sometimes I forget I'm from New York, and especially when I get introduced to people, someone is always like, "You're from Los Angeles, right? Or you're from Oklahoma, or you're from this place, or you're from that place," and I always have to remind myself as well as others that I'm from New York, and I think it plays an incredibly large role into how I see the world, but also how I see the art that I get to make each and every day. Um, I am looking to create the largest archive of tintypes of African Americans and global Africans, and that goal didn't come until the opening night of the show that I put together. Actually, on the photo uh, made by my best friend Ray at the gallery, in which I showed blown up scans of the tintypes that I made. The opening night of the show, there were about 300 people in the space, and we did a Q&A. And as a part of it, um, killed the lights and turned the space into a studio and a dark room to demonstrate in front of everyone how tintypes are made. I think that's the most important aspect of this project and this process. Um, I think as photographers, we all know there is a bit of mystery behind, like if you see a really amazing photograph and you're like, I wonder how this person did it. I think in this case, because the studio setting is so fixed, I'm able to open up the door, pull the curtain back a little bit, and literally show people what it's like to sit for a portrait, explain the science behind it, which I've done countless times over. And at the end of that demonstration that night in 2021, uh, I kind of blacked out and had this like long speech about how I wanted to like make all these amazing portraits and meet so many people and just go down the rabbit hole, uh, because it felt like I was just kind of getting into it. Ironically, as I was having a showcase that was open for about a month and a half, and I made a statement that I said, by the time I'm dead, I want 20,000 of these. And then thought for a second, I was like, man, that's a lot of work. And then as everyone was leaving the gallery and congratulating and saying nice things and planning what their next move was for the night, I sat in the gallery by myself and looked at all the portraits on the wall and did like rough math. Like, okay, if I do this many a day for this many straight days for this many years, it will take me X amount of years. I'm a former math teacher. And so having that kind of sensibility mathematically, I was like, okay, I figured the math in hindsight, the math was probably totally off and not taking into account like just things I need to do in my regular life, just to outside of being an artist, you know? Um, but it was something that I was like, oh, this is doable. And since then, thankfully, I've been given opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to continue pursuing this goal. And given the tangible nature of this medium, it's also allowed me to step a bit further into sculpture and performance art and demonstrating the many ways that photographs can be more than just pictures on a wall. I always talk to friends about how, in the grand scheme of all the artistic mediums that are available to us as human beings, it seems to me that if there were a proverbial or metaphorical totem pole, that photography is kind of towards the bottom. And I don't like that. And I have many reasons as to why, but I think it's because, in part, a lot of people, especially today, only see photographs on a screen on their phones. And so to open up people's eyes, especially to people who may not have the same access to the artistic mediums that many of us do have, to what's possible through photography specifically, I think it opens up a lot of pathways to hopefully.
Oh, Adam, I think you're muted. Hang on one sec. It's weird.
Oh, is that
No,
better?
I can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you. A big part of the origins of this project started in Los Angeles, California in 2020. This is a pandemic project. This is the fun part about explaining what this is knowing that in one of the worst periods of time in this country's history, in global history as well, that despite a lot of things that were going on that were terrible, that something like this was able to quite literally save my life. Um, Project started at St. Elmo Village in Mid-City Los Angeles. It is a Black owned and operated community arts organization that's been there for going on 60 years now. And as you can see in some of the photos, I have a mask on and there's a ton of outdoor space. And the house in the photo in this bottom right corner, that was my house. My partner at the time and I lived in that home. And we were able to welcome people to the space because there was so much outdoor space. And there was a dark room on site because the founder of the space was a multi talented artist who was also into photography and was a darkroom technician, a masterful one at that. And so I was able to utilize the darkroom on site there and would welcome people one at a time, um, maybe about an hour at a time, spaced out between anywhere from 10 a.m. to about 6 p.m. as long as I had sunlight, and we just used the natural light and create as many images as I could of just close friends, people that I've been meaning to photograph before the pandemic started, and now that everyone's inside just posting about what's going on. It was something that was really important to try to bring as many people together, knowing that we would be able to picnic together, socially distanced apart. We'd have cookouts, we'd have portrait sessions, we'd play music, we'd color, we do puzzles, we do all these different things in community with one another, knowing that this is something that we can take advantage of, given that there's so much space in Los Angeles, but there are very few places for people to congregate, especially during the pandemic where everyone felt safe to do so. And I was just really fortunate to be somewhere that could welcome that kind of congregation. Uh, want to share some work samples, and a big part of my favorite parts of this project, for one, but also just my general, like my overall artistic practice. I'm very, very big into process, almost, not even almost, definitely more so than the finished product. I was speaking to a dear friend of mine who came to visit me the other day, and he asked what were one of my bigger goals as in terms of being an artist or just as a human being. And I told him I want to get better at people. And as it pertains to my artistic practice, I can look at any of my photos or the photographs of any other artist and can gauge to a certain degree. Of course, not everyone can get it on the nose, but I feel like I can gauge how well they are able to decipher the human condition, how well they are, how good of a job they do at relating to other people, no matter the background, no matter what they look like, no matter what they've been through. And I think as diverse of a community as the Black community and the global African community is, I took it upon myself to try to get to know as many people as possible through this project. And the process of making the portraits, the conversations, the explanation of the sciences, the talking about the cities that people go to, live in, have traveled to, all compile into the final result. And I can look at some of my favorite portraits in this project and say like, oh, I can distinctly remember the conversation and the process before actually getting to the finished product. So here are some snippets, and there are some great images where I have the tintypes for the project. I make two per session. Everything is free for anyone that participates. And they keep one, I keep one. That's the deal. There's no catch. There's no crazy policy. It's just you show up, you sign up for a portrait, no matter who I collaborate with around America or around the world, and you take the time. You come for about an hour, and you leave with a signed tintype and a certificate of authenticity saying that you are part of this global project. This was made in Chicago, Illinois. The first tour that my best friend and I did with is an artist by the name of Theaster Gates. He has an organization called Rebuild Foundation that has a number of spaces dedicated to the arts and to the expansion of community growth. And they were so gracious to allow us to occupy the rotating kitchen space, like a rotating ghost kitchen space, um, on the south side of Chicago, to where we were able to kind of had a portrait set up in the front of a coffee shop. And it was really fun to just welcome people in. They would come in for a portrait, they'd have their computers, they'd have their children, they'd get some coffee, hang out with the Wi-Fi, and to see that not only was it a success, but it got to the point where it was the first time I'd experienced uh, like panic attacks, because through social media, so many people were aware of the project's existence in Chicago at that time. And there were people like lining up outside the door to sit for a portrait because there's like this sense of urgency, this like, oh, we want to participate with this thing. This is so cool. I'm excited to actually revisit Chicago in the coming months. This is a gentleman by the name of Shoes McGee, one of the most interesting people I've ever met. This was at the Greenwood Culture Center, right down the street from where I'm at now in downtown Tulsa. Um, he drove his family. I think it was like 7 or 8 hours from Houston to visit the cultural center. The Greenwood Culture Center is a space that is both educational. It is used for community programming. It is used for festivals. It is used for commemorations. It is used for sharing information about the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre as well. That is one of its main purposes. And he decided to bring his family around Juneteenth to educate his partner, his young son, and especially his daughter entering her teenage years about what had happened on Black Wall Street in 1921, a little bit over 100 years ago. Um, these kinds of moments, I of course have the tintypes, but to add context, which is really important to me as well, I try to have a number of cameras around just to snap some photos and make some images that looking back 30, 40, 50 years from now, I'll be able to say, oh, this is a bit more about this family, or that any archivist or myself could come together and compile a lot more information about the people that I got to meet. Because of course, this project cannot happen. I can't stress it enough without people. This is a really fun day. Carell and Kim Thompson showed up when I was in Charlotte last year. I was able to collaborate um, with a residency organization that housed me and allowed me to occupy space at two different public libraries in predominantly Black neighborhoods throughout Charlotte. And as someone who was practically raised in a library growing up as a kid, uh, being the child of two educators, that was one of my favorite places. So when I was asked, where would you want to set up shop? I was like, oh, can I do it at the library? And they're like, yeah, we can make that happen. And funny enough, the Thompsons are actually the owners of one of my favorite pizzerias in America. It's Bird Pizzeria and right outside of downtown Charlotte. And it was fun knowing that Carell was raised in Cleveland, Ohio, which is, I'm not surprised, but it's also kind of funny saying it out loud. Like it's Cleveland, Ohio is one of my favorite places, if not my favorite place to be in America. And there was like an immediate kinship hearing from him, that hearing his story and knowing that he was from Cleveland and how he ended up making his way to North Carolina. It was a really fun portrait session. This is Charisse Terry. She's the owner and proprietor of Archive Charlotte. It's an archive space. It's a coffee shop. It's an event space. It serves a myriad of purposes, but I think most importantly, it serves as a safe space for the Black community in a predominantly Black part of town that doesn't have as much access to both safe spaces, to air conditioning and Wi-Fi, but also to the arts. And she's a proper archivist. Like she's like you walk into that space and you're like, oh, this looks like something out of the 60s, 70s, 80s, or 90s. There's all sorts of Jet magazines piled up from floor to ceiling. There's like any sort of like tour poster, vinyl, cassette, CD that you can think of. And not only are these items available for you to peruse through, purchase, and just look at, but she's a wealth of knowledge herself, and she was a pillar of the community there, and it was an honor to photograph her. It was a really fun day. And behind her is my dog, Carmen. She goes everywhere with me. She actually travels to every city I've been to, and she just hit 14 years old. So it's fun to be able to bring an old lady around with me and just have my rock around, whether I'm with my best friend Ray, or if I'm meeting with people that are in the city that I spend a lot of time with. No matter what, I know that my dog is always around and I can like feel a bit more comfortable in any space. This is a fun one. This is Candace Harris. She's a really, really talented painter, writer, just all around great human being. Who started painting and has recently entered art school to actually study painting full time. Um, I show this image because, as you can see, she's painting on top of a tintype. It's an 8x10 portrait of her, one of the first 8x10 I'd ever made. But I wanted to show this because in just about every city I go to, on top of the portrait sessions being a collaborative experience between myself and the subject or the sitter, throughout the conversation, if I ever learn that someone's an artist, I go, "What do you make?" And they tell me, "Oh, I'm a director. Oh, I'm a this. I'm a sculptor. I make this. I make films. I make food. I'm this. I'm that." If they say something that sparks an idea for a sort of collaboration, I give them homework. As a former teacher, I always want to give people homework. And over the past couple of years, since I've toured, actually, if I meet a painter and go, "Hey, would you do me a favor? I'm making two portraits. Can you take the one that I'm going to keep with you and paint on it? And then before I leave, bring it back. Or let's connect somehow through social media. Let's exchange phone numbers. And before I leave, if you can't come back to the studio, which I think was a really important thing um, for people to be aware of, that was a really fun part about touring, and still is to this day, is that if you had a good experience your first day, and they go, "Man, I would love to bring my cousin. I'd love to bring my sister. I'd love to bring my mother and father." I would just say, "You know where I'm going to be every day. You're more than welcome to come back." And it was the same experience to where there were a number of painters that would come back, some of whom would just bring their painted tintype back and just sit there for hours just to watch other people experience the magic of being photographed in this way. And so when I mentioned this idea to Candace, she was all in for it, and she turned her entire home into a studio. And this was just a moment making an image of her as she was painting and referencing the digital scan of the portrait below. So this is a very iconic image. Of course, I hope you guys know I didn't make this portrait of Frederick Douglass, but I made this image of the portrait for many a reason, of course. But I had the pleasure of being a part of a residency at the New Orleans Museum of Art in December of 2022 through to the middle of January 2023, making tintypes at the museum. I think it was like 4 or 5 days a week, in conjunction or in partnership with. It was a show on display there titled "Call to the Camera: Black American Studio Photographers." And like I said earlier, I'm not an art school graduate. I'm a constant learner. I'm a constant sponge. I hope to remain that way. And so being a part of the programming for this show, learning about the history of photography as it pertained to African Americans and global Africans was really, really pivotal for myself. And the exhibit covered images made as far back as Frederick Douglass. This image was actually on loan from the Museum of Modern Art. No, actually, not MoMA, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And I actually ended up getting to meet the curator, who was, unbeknownst to me, when big museums loan out really iconic pieces of art that can fit in a suitcase with a handcuff tied to your wrist, they actually come pick it up themselves. I didn't know that. So I met him because he was there on the final day of the exhibition to retrieve the artwork and make sure it got back to New York City very safely, which I thought was pretty cool. But to see the history of photography spanning all the way back to daguerreotype of the most photographed African American man in history, all the way through to some of the more modern day contemporaries that I look up to or I'm sitting alongside to this day, it was really pivotal. And to then be included in the conversation to where there are people in New Orleans or in the greater Louisiana area to come to this museum show to look at images, most of which, especially of this variety of a daguerreotype variety or any wet plate photography, to go, "What is that?" And then most of the time, if I wasn't in the studio making portraits, I was just snooping around the gallery just to listen to people's reactions to these kinds of images. And if I had free time, if the schedule wasn't booked up, I'd say, "Hey," someone would say, "Oh, what kind of photo is this?" and I would just lean over it. It was kind of creepy. I can think of that in hindsight, but in the moment, as they were like, "What kind of image is this?" I lean over their shoulder and say, "You can get one for free upstairs. Follow me." And it was fun to gain that kind of trust from people because, of course, I'm a stranger, but also to say, "What do you mean I can get an image like this?" And then I explain who I was, what I was doing, and say, hey, of course, I'd have to show proof, or thankfully, the museum staff, they thought it was funny because I would do it a lot. But the museum staff would be like, no, he's actually telling the truth. This is like a legitimate thing. And we go upstairs, and within 30 minutes, they would leave with a portrait that they knew nothing about of themselves for free because they just went to go see it of someone else. I thought that was really pivotal. And to have that full circle moment was really important. And I follow this up with now a bit of a behind the scenes now that I'm living in Oklahoma as a part of the Tulsa Artist Fellowship. The first time that I actually made tintypes in Oklahoma, I recently bought my first car. This is my 99 Tacoma. It's a workhorse, love the truck. I nicknamed it Clifford because it's red. But as someone who is used to doing stuff in a studio or using natural light, I thought that I was able to turn my truck into a dark room and do everything out of the back of the truck and kind of have this like mobile thing. And it was the first time making portraits at a black rodeo ever. And I was ridiculously nervous. And to step into like a new pathway in the same way that I'm learning about the history of photography as it pertains to my community, to learn about a new corner of my community through the rodeo, I was both intrigued, very interested, and extremely nervous. And I had a cowboy hat, had a leather jacket, my boots. I felt like a poser. And to then go into this space asking people that I'd never met before, hey, would you be open to sitting for a free portrait? It only takes a few minutes. That's been my pitch to everyone. And ironically, all the portraits that I made that day were terrible, absolutely horrible for a bunch of reasons that I don't even think we have enough time for me to explain. But to step into this new space where now I'm following all the black rodeos throughout the state of Oklahoma and in other states, other cities as well. But now because this is my backyard, I get to follow all these rodeos and create like a true community here. I want this body of work when I look back on it in however many decades from now to be as diverse and to reflect the true diversity of how diverse the Black community is globally, and to see that the Black rodeo, I don't know if you guys are aware, it's been historic, the Black rodeos, for a number of reasons. It's spanned all the way back to pre-Jim Crow, but also thinking about the resurgence of the Black rodeos today, whether it's through fashion, whether it's through music, whether it's through just the younger people's identification of something that seems new and refreshing. The Black rodeo has become quite a staple in a lot of people's lives. My age, a little bit older, a little bit younger, people that have been going to these rodeos for decades. And to be a part of it has been a privilege. And to now go to them in this fashion was a learning opportunity to now be photographing people, and some of these people that I meet are dear friends. This was notice how I'm not using a truck anymore as a dark room. Notice how I'm not using the side of my truck as a studio. This is actually the setup that I use most often. It is pretty tedious to put up and break down each time, but it's very, very, very much so worth it. I use a 10 foot by 10 foot tent as a studio. I try to control as much light as I can. You see that there are light leaks in the corners, but the portraits come out great. The ways in which I've learned the little do's and don'ts about this process is helped propel the work into its next level of mastery that I'm excited to continue going down that rabbit hole. Um, I don't have a picture of it because I actually couldn't find it in my archives, but I also use the 10 foot by 10 foot tent as a studio. Beside the tent, you can picture in your head. I don't know if you guys participate or partake in the use of recreational or medicinal marijuana. I've never done so myself, but I do know that there are tents that people can use to grow weed. It's completely light sealed. It's anywhere from like a 4 or 5 foot square, anywhere from like 5 or 6 feet tall. And I actually use that as a dark room. And it's collapsible. I can break it down, throw it in the back of the truck with all the other gear. And I've done it at close to 20 rodeos since April. And it's been fun because now a lot of these people have begun to recognize that, oh yeah, I figured you would be here. You're the picture guy. You're a picture man, or you're the tintype person. And it's fun re-meeting or running into these people that when I first met them was like, what's a tintype? And the next time I see them at another rodeo, I go, oh, you're the tintype guy. And having a little bit of knowledge as to what it is that these images are and the significance of them, especially being portraits of Black people. So here's some portraits um, that I've made over the years. I didn't want to just limit it to stuff that I've made recently. Um, and I always start with these two because I feel like that's kind of like these two are the images that are both in conversation with each other, but also stand out significantly for some obvious reasons, some not so obvious reasons. But of course, former President Barack Obama, as well as Amir Questlove Thompson. These images are made pretty close in proximity in the year 2022. Uh, the first being of Questlove in Africatown, Alabama. Questlove is a descendant of the last slave ship to reach America in Alabama. It was illegal how his descendants got here, but they got there nonetheless. And he was on a show with Henry Louis Gates, who's a famous historian um, who tracked his lineage back to the descendants of that ship. And then it turned into, because of that show, because of those findings, it turned into a documentary on Netflix to this day, which I suggest everyone watch, called Descendants. And it tracks the story of not only people like Amir, but also the many other descendants that still live in Africatown, Alabama to this day. The reason why former President Barack Obama is related to this image whatsoever is because his and his wife's production company produced the film, produced the documentary that's on Netflix. And so once I made the images of the descendants in Africatown for the premiere of the documentary in Alabama, word got up to President Obama and the First Lady, and they requested to also be photographed in the same way to draw more and more eyes to the documentary as they were going towards award season. These are some of the first images that I've made, actually. These are, ironically, I go back and forth quite often about whether I prefer natural light portraits versus studio portraits. Sometimes, depending on how strong the sun is, I can't even tell, but there's little subtle details that give it away. And of course, because I was there, I know, but I hope when I ask people that weren't there what they think of the images and ask for feedback, et cetera, et cetera. Duran Fisher and John Tay Spinks are some of the most beautiful people I've ever met in my life. And I'm fortunate to call them friends. And these portraits were made at a time when COVID-19 was at its most violent, especially in Los Angeles. And being away from my family in New York City as it completely ravaged through New York City, it was something that was tough to deal with. And having friends come by, and if, not even talking about what was going on around the world, but to just spend time with each other, having not seen anyone in months, was a pleasure. And ironically, the first 54 portraits that I made for this series were a part of an exhibition that I spoke about a bit earlier, but also I turned them into a deck of playing cards and tried to curate who would be what card and for what reason. And the image on the left of Duran, uh, I didn't know he was going to wear it. He didn't know he was going to wear it. But when he came for his portrait and he shook my hand and he posed for the image and I saw the ring, I was like, oh, you're the ace of spades. Like you have to be. And some of these images kind of spoke to the project. It didn't necessarily have to be decided upon by myself. It was something that I was able to just be in the moment, be present, and let the person come to me. And I think going back to being good at people and reading people and understanding the human condition, some of these kinds of things are still why I still love calling this project Black Magic, because it quite literally is a magical moment. These are some images that I made in red, maybe a little bit different. I've been able to make tintypes of all colors, and I haven't really experimented too much with it. I'm excited to do so in the coming years, and be very intentional about the use of color in these images and the concepts behind why I use color in my images. Um, there's not that much like flair to it. It's quite literally just different color plates. When I first started to share these images on social media after having shared images that are perceived to be black and white of the same medium, and people were like, "How did you make it red? You must be some sort of scientific genius." And I'd get messages, and I kind of had to burst their bubble and be like, "No, it's just red plates." But when I was made aware that you can change the color of them, someone gifted me in the same way that the first 20 plates that I made were made with gifted materials by a gentleman by the name of Jeff Kober. I was gifted 20 red plates. And I was like, "Why are you giving me red ones? I need black ones." He's like, "No, you can use red." I'm like, "Okay." And I made the plates and they came out great. And I've been obsessed with figuring out ways to further incorporate color into my practice as possible. These are some images made in Detroit, Michigan, my time at Darkroom Detroit. The image on the left of Mio Shirage Noir. When she walked in, I told her, "You look like a woman with the pearl earring." And she was like, "Yeah, I like that." And she's also a painter, which made it fun because I have this original scan. I've never shown the painted version. I'm looking forward to doing so. Ironically, now that I think about it, my last time in Boston, there was an exhibition at the Museum of Fine Art called Painted Tintypes. And I actually hosted a field trip um, with the organization that I collaborated with in town to go visit the museum, talk about the artworks, share stories about making tintypes and their significance historically, and bring more attention to both their exhibition as well as my project. And it was a great conversation, great exhibition. And just a great time like hanging out with other young Black art enthusiasts that, again, a lot of people don't know about these kinds of images. And at this point, I'm fortunate enough to consider myself even a small steward into this field, because as new pathways open, it allows for more creativity to flow. The the image on the right, Nate and Melu, I forgot how old she was, but she had a ton of energy and like a ton of confidence. And when it came time to pose for their portrait, I was like, "Oh, I'm ready. Just don't move. Please don't move." And her dad was like, "Are you really gonna do that?" And she didn't move a muscle. She was like, "Mm-hmm." Like it was just really fun to see someone that confident in what they wanted to do. And it's part of the reason why it's one of my favorite portraits, because as a former teacher, seeing young children exude that much confidence is like it's like a cheat code into adulthood if you can maintain that. And to see that it was both supported by mom and dad who were present, but also upheld by the child. It was like Maylee was great. She was really cool. These are made a bit more recently. Um, uh, Xavier Scott Marshall is one of my favorite photographers and directors on the planet, and I got to meet him. This was a test shoot, actually. It was the night before I had a gig for a big music company making tintypes of some other musical artists, and we're at our friend Michaela Chandler's studio in downtown Los Angeles. And I was like, "Yo, I need somebody to photograph really quick. Like, would you be down?" I photographed Michaela a bunch of times already. And she was like, "Oh, but I'm gonna have my friend X with me." And I didn't know who X was, thinking like X was like a nickname or something like that, or like a pseudonym for something else that I had no awareness of. And he shows up, and I think I have a photographic memory. So when I saw his face, I was like, "I know who you are. That's cool. Nice to meet you, man. I love your work." And it was mutual. And then we went inside and we had our conversation. We made the portraits and they were great. And to meet some of my favorite artists, Amber J. Phillips being another one of my favorite artists, it's been a pleasure, because I'm not that outgoing. I can be, but I think I've been gifted with this project and this purpose so that if I'm not feeling the most outgoing, but I still want to make art and still want to like be in conversation and congregation with other people, I open the doors to the studio and knock on wood, thankfully, there have been people anxiously awaiting to enter the doors of the studio to sit for a portrait and to learn more about the project and just learn about each other as people. It's been fun. Both of these portraits are made within like they were made in like 5 minutes. Like X had to leave, Ambrose headed to a party, but was dressed for both a portrait session and a party or a rave like 10 minutes afterwards. So she literally came in, threw some music on. I already had the plates prepped, and she sat down, two portraits. She didn't even leave with hers. She had to just go. She didn't want to be late. And so a few days after that, when I was still in Los Angeles, I actually, and I'm going to refer to it in a second. I I brought about 30 to 40 of my friends to the Bill Pickett Invitational Rodeo's 40th anniversary show in Los Angeles recently, and she attended, and I was able to gift her portrait then. But it's some of these images, some of these interactions can go anywhere from 5 minutes to several hours at a time, and it's fun to be as fluid and as prepared as possible because sometimes I haven't been prepared, and those images may never see the light of day. Now it's some rodeo stuff. This is this is where I'm starting to see how the practice is fleshing itself out, or like how I can understand how my presence in Oklahoma is a bit more felt. Um, and not necessarily referring to like my presence, but the opportunity to make this kind of work in this context. It's very rare that I make work somewhere for longer than a few weeks if I'm on tour. But now that I live here, this is my home for the foreseeable future. Having repeat presence in these spaces allows me to confidently walk up to some of the members of the rodeo community and just say, "Hey, love your look," or "Would you come to sit for a portrait? It's free." And I'm still surprised to this day when people say yes. I'm not gonna lie, and I think it's because if someone were to ask me something like that, my skepticism antennas go up immediately. But to know that there's trust there and just we look alike in some way. Yeah, let's do it. Let's just, how long does it take? And I say about 5 minutes because I'm already prepared. The plate's already done, the whole nine. And in that same vein, the image on the left of 2-year-old Raymond Dan, 2 years old. This image was made at around midnight at a rodeo in Beggs, which is quite honestly somehow in between the middle of nowhere in Tulsa. It's not too far away, but it's kind of far away if you're not familiar. Um, Most of these rodeos, they're structured in a way where the most exciting event, the most crowd engaging event is the Pony Express. For those of you that don't know, the Pony Express is pretty similar to, if not exactly like a relay race on horseback. Two teams, 8 cowboys or cowgirls race around a series of barrels and quite literally hand off a baton. And it's actually represented the Pony Express mailmen who would travel on horseback across the country to deliver important messages during the wars. And then after the wars, before the invention of the car, people would quite literally be riding horseback as quickly as they could across the country. And this was just a way, knowing that especially this event is home and created in Oklahoma, anytime you see a Pony Express race, everyone's on their feet. It's standing in the middle of the arena is one of the most exciting things I've ever seen in my entire life. And so the rodeo is structured around that. And of course, bull riding, barrel racing, steer and decorating, uh, bulldogging, all the events. Mud busting is one of my favorite when little kids around Raymond's age, they hug a sheep and they let it out of a gate. So it's kind of like kids' version of bull riding. It's really fun. The calf roping and slack are typically some of the last events of the evening that happen after bull riding, happen after the Pony Express. And as I said, those are the most crowd engaging. So when those events are done, the majority of the crowd leaves. And so this happens around 11 o'clock, 11:30 p.m. And I decided for this particular rodeo, because I would have packed up and left with them at most rodeos myself, I decided to stick around because there's one young gentleman uh, who is a member of the Demery family. Actually, the Demery family puts on the rodeo and begs every year, that had uh, a really intricately made and strung rope to calf rope, but he also had calf a rope like case. And I'd never seen a case for a rope before. I was like, that's how precious these things are, which I thought was really cute. And not just cute, but just like really cool to see someone like care for a rope as much as some people would care for their shoes or their car or their hats or whatever the case is. And I kept trying to make his portrait. It's like, hey, you ready to make your portrait? And he would say yes. And he was a younger guy, no older than like 17, 18 years old. But his attention was split between his name being called to calf rope and sitting for a portrait. It's almost akin to like trying to make a portrait of an NBA athlete seconds before tip off rather than just waiting till after the game to make the portrait. So at a certain point, once I saw him hop over the gate into the arena, I was like, oh, he's very busy. He's locked into his process, which I respected. And he actually ended up, I think, either winning or placing second in his division, which I thought was really cool. So after that point, I decided to just stick around and watch. And as I turned the corner to walk into the arena to watch from a first person standpoint, as opposed to sitting in the stands, I see Raymond. The little cowboy hat, has his rope around his shoulder, holding his grandfather's hand. I'm like, who is this beautiful young man hanging out with his family? And I asked his mother and his grandfather, say, hey, my name's Adam. I don't know if you saw or heard, I have this portrait booth over there. I'd love to make a portrait of this young man for free if you have a second. And they immediately oblige and their face lit up. Mind you, it's almost midnight, so everyone's dead tired. One thing that I didn't account for when I first started going to black rodeos in Oklahoma is that they last anywhere from 6 to 8 hours. They may start at 6 p.m., but then go till midnight, sometimes even longer than that. And so I walk up to them and their faces look drained. And I walk up and say, hey, can I make a picture of this young man? And their faces light up as if they'd had a quadruple shot of espresso and it was perfectly sunny out. It's almost the same thing happened with the portrait on the right of the Johnson sisters and Cabriana Fields. The 121st Bowley Rodeo happens every year, and it's almost like the Super Bowl of rodeos throughout the state. It's really cool. And I've been very curious, and I was intentional about adding these two portraits in particular because I've been very curious as to where young people hang out, young Black people hang out in Oklahoma, in Tulsa, of course, but also in the greater state of Oklahoma. And church is a given. I haven't even stepped into that field yet to make portraits because I know there's so much that comes with that, and I want to be very delicate, just as I've been delicate with black rodeos and the rodeo. Of course, there are other opportunities for people to spend time, but if on any given day, on a weekend or on a summer day, there's a rodeo, chances are you'll see somebody. And I approached these three young women, and they were like, "We've seen you before," and I was like, "Okay, good. You've seen it. You may not know what the images look like, but you've seen at least the tent because there's vendors all over these black rodeos selling food, maybe selling t-shirts, boots. There's typically like a mechanical bull for the kids to ride, but there's never really a photo booth. So if you see a 4x5 camera that most people have never seen before, and these strobe lights and the generator, and for those that do partake in smoking marijuana, a big weed tent and a big red truck sitting next to you. You're like, oh, I've seen this quite literally dozens of times. What are you doing? Making pictures. Oh, how much do they cost? That's another question that comes up all the time. And I try not to even just say I'm making portraits. I say I'm doing free portraits because the thing that shifts people's minds, although so many people have been eager to pay, the accessibility of making these free has been the foundation of this project, and I don't intend on, although I've charged for commissions before when necessary, the goal is to make this as accessible and as free as possible for people. So in the second that I mentioned that they were free, they're like, "Oh yeah, come on, we'll do it real quick." And I made this portrait, and at that particular rodeo, um, being that we're in Tornado Alley in Oklahoma, I made this portrait, and then about 20 minutes later, that 10-foot by 10-foot tent had blown over into the arena because it was a twister advisory that hit, and everyone was like running back to the cars. I had to run back over, and thankfully, some people had like grabbed the legs of the tent before it like damaged any property or harmed any of the animals that were part of the rodeo. But some of these things, telling these stories are pretty indicative of like how fun this process is, but also most of these rodeos that I go to make images, there's hours of prep work that goes into it, hours of breaking down, money spent on gas, on materials, on food, on all the things. And I may walk away from each rodeo with like 3 or 4 images at a time. And I would do it every single time. Don't care. And knowing when I tell people in a more stable and fixed studio setting, when I make it, they go, "Yeah, you're gonna do this every time." I go, "Yeah, I know, it's crazy, right?" That's kind of how you make these. There's no other way to make these kinds of images, which I think speaks to the individual approach and intentional care behind each image, both having your hand being directly involved with it, but also you can tell by the final result how much care has gone into photographing the people and doing my best to humanize each person as possible. Again, this project can't happen without people. So there's a couple other stories that have been pivotal in my understanding of what this project is and can be. The first being uh, this is a friend of mine named Chaz. He's the son of Dan Stevens. Dan and Ronald Stevens are at the DNR Ranch, maybe 10 minutes up the street from me, up in Turley, Oklahoma. I met Chaz Juneteenth, 2021. Um, he's an artist, he's an educator, he's a debate team coach, he's a stand-up comedian, he's just a great human being, very, very nice person that him and his father put me onto a great amount of history as it pertained to black cowboys, black cowgirls, the culture of traveling America for the rodeos. That it gave me a lot of insight as to how I would go about approaching so many of the athletes that I can call friends to this day. And this is the first time, quite honestly, that I like touched a horse. It was crazy. In my whole life, I'd never like been face to face with a horse, and also been in front of a black person who looked like me, who was so comfortable being around horses. I'm from New York City. The only time we saw a horse was like walking through Midtown Manhattan on those carriages when they carry people through like around Central Park. That was like it. So to see an entirely different cultural shift and being welcomed into that was really pivotal and really important for me. This was a scene from a Black entrepreneurship summer workshop. It was like summer camp for these young kids at the Greenwood Cultural Center. And during my residency there in 2021, I was there for a month. And I think my time in Tulsa in 2021 led to living here now. My first visit was during the 100-year anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, where I got to come to the city with my older sister, Jazzy, the owner of a Black woman-owned bookstore called Reparations Club in Los Angeles, California. She brought me, and I was introduced to the Culture Center as we were waiting for President Biden at the time to show up to the Culture Center to pay respects to the staff and the board at the Culture Center, as well as Dr. Tiffany Crutcher of the Terrence Crutcher Foundation. And from that point on, just been putting conversation with people over there. So when I was graciously allowed to set up shop in the building, I noticed that there were a ton of kids running around, and I was like, "What are these kids doing here?" And they go, "Oh yeah, summer camp. We do it every year." And for that whole month, would greet the students every morning, hang out with them during our lunchtime, during their lunchtime, made portraits of a bunch of them, and got to show them the process to a certain degree. They ended up actually making a ton of images in that studio themselves as a part of like their daily programming, where they weren't working on the Black entrepreneurship curriculum. They're like, can we go hang out with Adam and Ray in the studio, make pictures in the darkroom, do all the red stuff? And they were like eager to participate. And it was fun. It constantly reignites my excitement to do this work whenever I'm around a group of young people, especially young kids who may not have access to art, or even if they do and they're just enthusiasts that are genuinely interested in working in these mediums. It's always fun. And this is just a moment during their recess after eating some lunch sandwiches outside that I have a huge print of them at home. I cherish it to this day. This was at the 40th LA Bill Pickett Invitational Rodeo that just happened recently in Los Angeles. I'd met Devin, Maya, and Kaylin um, the year prior and made a portrait of them without getting their names, without getting any contact information, without exchanging social media handles or whatever. And upon returning to this past one, uh, ran into them, and I was with my friend Ray, and he goes, don't they look familiar? And he goes, what are you talking about, man? And I realized he wasn't with me, and our friend that was with us, Sid, the owner of Art House Film Lab, he was like, I kind of recognize him, and I pulled up a photo that I had made of them the year prior, and they were like, whoa, that is them. And I walk up to these young ladies and I go, hey, is this you? And I show them the photo and they're like, whoa, that is us. Wait, that's you. And we had like a rekindling moment. And it was great to just reconnect with them. And I was reintroduced to their family members. We had a whole moment last year, and to have that moment again in a deeper way, a more familiar way was really great. And thankfully, I was able to make some images of them again under a different context, which was great. I was actually on assignment for the Los Angeles Times, making images commemorating the 40th anniversary of the Bill Pickett Rodeo. And after I made the portraits and we had a bunch of fun and we exchanged contact information and we had some food and some drinks, um, right before I left them for the evening, I was like, hey, by the way, this is going to be in the newspaper in a couple of weeks. And they're like, wait, what? And it was fun to just have that moment and to be able to honor this culture, to honor this community in a myriad of ways has been a pleasure, especially knowing that like you see these people all the time. I may not see these three young ladies until next year's rodeo, but I look forward to it. In the same way that if someone goes, you're the picture man, right? From the last rodeo to the next rodeo, I always look forward to seeing familiar faces because that's how communities are built. And it was something that, as someone who's a hermit, I can be, like I said, I'm a studio rat. I love being in the studio all the time. I don't mind being in the dark room for 18, 19, 20 hours a day with a couple bathroom breaks and some food in between. But knowing that when I do enter the community and I do enter the outside world, that there are people that I can connect with and look forward to seeing. It's something that the Black Rodeo has deeply reminded me of, and I'm really fortunate to be out here. This is one of my favorite moments ever. I'm not a parent yet, but I hope to do something like this with my kid when I end up bringing a kid into this world. This was actually in Delia Diner in Tulsa, my favorite place to eat breakfast out here if I don't cook it myself. It's right down the street, right over the bridge. And seeing parenthood in different places, whether the culture calls for different approaches to parenthood, or whether you start to see that there are very particular through lines or similarities in parenthood across the country around the world. One thing that will never escape a parent from my eyes, as still being just a child, is teaching math. And as a math teacher, witnessing a mother teaching her son 2 plus 2 at a diner after eating pancakes was one of the most like mind-blowing things to watch. Even as someone who's been an educator for over 7 years, it's something that it never gets old. Like seeing someone connect the dots between like 1, 2, 3, 4, and you like counting on your fingers and all these different things for young Black people to show eagerness in learning as I did I kind of saw myself in this young man, and I saw my mother and mom on in the bottom right corner, and I got to send them this image. And as you all know, some of these moments can come and go with a blink of an eye. And I was just really lucky. I actually didn't even make this on my own camera. I'd run out of film on the way into the diner, and as we sat, we were sat like perched directly above these two who were eating and going over math problems. So I asked Ray if I could use his camera, and he had about 4 or 5 frames left on his camera in his roll. And when I developed the film, he just sent over those frames like, I remember you made these, and you were like, because you were like very, very, very excited to do it. And they didn't bat an eye, and they just kept working on their math problems. And mom could kind of tell that I was kind of hovering, and I tried not to be like too obvious. And I'm pretty sure he was using a Nikon film camera at the time. It was and it was one of those like loud, like, but it was one of those like, like it's like the electric monitor, so you can hear it. It wasn't incognito whatsoever, nor was I really trying to be after a certain point. I just wanted to make sure that moment was captured. And yeah, I love this image. It's one of my favorites for sure. I think that's one of the last images here, but this is Lester Calise at Preservation Hall. This project, also all these images that you see from the stories to the behind the scenes. Um, I mentioned his name before, but Sid at Art House Film Lab scans, develops, and cans cinema grade film from Kodak or their own formulas to make these images. He introduced himself to me. We met. He came to my house in, I forget, I think it was either 2022. I haven't even known him for that long, but he's been such a pillar in the Black arts community in Los Angeles before I moved, and to this day, to countless friends around the country and around the world. His film has been taken all over the world, where creators of color have access to cinema grade film to make the images look like they were actually shot in a movie, which I think is really special. Um, this image was made using one of those rolls of film from Sid, and this is at Preservation Hall in the French Quarter in New Orleans, 2023, as part of my residency and exhibition that I was a part of with another artist by the name of Felly, called Presence and Precarity, a Louisiana Fairy Tale. The show um, showcasing two wet plate artists drawing eyes to the double consciousness, or it was in the title, the precarity of living in a city like New Orleans that has such a rich and vibrant culture, but also has a treacherous history of violence and oppression. And we wanted to draw attention to a very specific um, community of people that are able to showcase how beautiful New Orleans is, how beautiful Louisiana is, and also through the notes that they most of the time improvise, show some of the not so positive parts of living in New Orleans or living in Louisiana or in the greater South. And jazz musicians came up. And so I was granted the opportunity to make wet plate portraits of all the Black musicians, all the jazz musicians that play at this jazz club, Preservation Hall. It's a historic jazz club right in the heart of the quarter, right around the corner from Bourbon Street. You can literally get smacked in the face with a bead necklace just from walking right outside the club. And it's some of the greatest music I've heard played live. And there's a documentary coming out on my time there. It's a short film coming out pretty soon, but this was more behind the scenes and hearing these stories. I ask everyone the same question during my sessions. I always ask, when was the last time you failed at something? I think alongside the where are you from, or how old are you, or where do you live, or where are your favorite places to eat out here? The question about failure to me opens up a ton of pathways in terms of how to guide the conversation, because it leaves people vulnerable for one, but also It allows people to interpret what the word failure means in real time if they haven't already combated with that word themselves in recent time. And people reveal something as menial as I missed the bus on the way to school yesterday, all the way up to someone may have relapsed, or someone has talked about being unfaithful in a relationship, and using it as a as an opportunity to confide in someone that may not be able to, in their words, do anything with that information. But it's really dependent upon how they choose to approach it. And I welcome any and all answers. I don't try to limit it in any particular way. And hearing some of the stories about failure from these jazz musicians that have traveled the world to play music was some of the most riveting conversations. Some of whom were documented. I try my best to record the audio from some of these conversations, but in certain ones, I just have to sit and listen. And a lot of these people that I got to photograph were elders. So it was just listening to an elder share stories about their lives, about their families, about their travels, about the woes of being a musician, the woes of being a jazz musician, the woes of being a jazz musician in New Orleans. All these layers of traumas and triumphs. I think it spoke very particularly to the show. I think that's why we went and we decided upon that title, Presence and Precarity, Louisiana Fairy Tale, because it did address the double consciousness of it all, the highs and the lows, the pros and the cons of what was going on. And through these portraits, we got to shed some light on their stories as um, jazz musicians, especially in New Orleans, are such a pillar, an anchor in the community, and may not always be held in the same regard as they would be socially. So it was fun to be in community with these people and shed some light on what they're doing. I added this image to this for the presentation also because the one thing I've grown to enjoy and welcome within the greater context of the project that I'm working on is that whether I'm reaching out to an organization or reaching out to a particular person to hopefully collaborate with them to bring my project to their city, I also field requests to bring my practice and my expertise in this medium to bring it into their context. And I never shy away from it. It's fun to be able to say, oh, you would like me to photograph these people for this show, for this project, for this commission, knowing that I still get to walk away with an image from my archive and be able to have it live under so many contexts, live under so many roofs, that it's like, oh, this was part of the greater Black Magic project. And it was also made during this time for this project, for this show, for this thing, and speak to not only just the visual identity of Black people, but to speak specifically to certain issues within the community in ways that my project may not be able to, or in ways that it will be able to, and just have a stronger visual aid, a stronger community to then piggyback off of when it comes time to add more context as to where or why these images were made. That is the end of the presentation. I have this QR code, right? I wanted to see if this will work. This QR code, I know I mentioned the Bill Pickett Rodeo and the rodeos in general. You can scan this QR code with your phones, and it'll lead you to an LA Times article, an essay that I got to write, and the images that I got to make honoring the Bill Pickett Rodeo and just Black rodeos in general. Um, it worked on my phone. I see some thumbs up. I'm hoping I'll just leave this up for a little while longer so you guys can have an opportunity to scan it and get some reading in. I always try to, again, I'm still a teacher, try to get some reading in from somebody. But like I said at the beginning, is an honor to present. It's an honor to be in community with you all. This is like a meeting of the nerds, and I consider myself to be a very deep nerd. So this is something that I always look forward to, just talking about photography. This